Good evening and welcome to this meeting of Troy City Council. It's Monday, April 18th, 2022. My name is William Lutz. I'm President of Council. Tonight we will begin our proceedings with the invocation and the Pledge of Allegiance given by Mrs. Snee this evening. Please stand.
Please bow your heads. Dear God, thank you for your abundant blessings on our community and for this opportunity to meet to discuss ways to make that community better. Guide us in our deliberations and decisions tonight. We ask that you watch over and protect those that safeguard our nation, our state, and our city. Be with people living in areas where there is war and unrest, especially the people of Ukraine. We pray that there can be peace there and everywhere. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Present.
Mr. Sievert?
Here.
Mrs. Marshall?
Here.
Mr. Phillips?
Here.
Mr. Whidden?
Here.
Mrs. Snee?
Here.
Mr. Rozelle?
Here.
Mr. Pierce?
Present.
Mr. Twist?
Here.
All members are present.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. This time we're going to hand the proceedings off to Mayor Oda, who has presentations to make to some police officers in attendance tonight.
So, April 7th, we had Miami County Law Enforcement Awards tonight, and 5 of our Troy police officers were a part of that. And I thought it was very important to introduce them to City Council and to the community, and to give them some of that recognition right here at home, even though they were recognized at a county award ceremony. So, Officer Laura Blankenship and Officer Adam Simpson are not here tonight, but Laura won the Distinguished Service Medal. Adam was given the Chief's Commendation Medal, so we want to make sure that we know that they are honored for those. Tonight we have with us Sergeant Matt Mosier. Matt, would you come on up? Matt received the Distinguished Service Medal Award from Chief McKinney. Thank you. Thank you very much. And then Terry Ray is here also. Terry received a meritorious service medal. She started off downstairs. She started off downstairs in kind of the front office of the police department and has now been moved upstairs. She is now Chief McKinney's assistant. And we're going to miss you downstairs, but congratulations for that award. And then Officer Scott Gates, Officer of the Year for 2021. So just wanted to present these 3 officers, well, 2 officers and 1 personal assistant to the chief. Wanted to present those to City Council and to the community. Thank you all very much and congratulations.
Thank you. Well, real quick, looking good.
It was a great evening. Congratulations.
Congratulations again to Sergeant Mosier, Ms. Ray, and Officer Gates. Thank you for attending tonight. Moving on, we will have a summary of the minutes read by Mrs. Knight for the April 4th, 2022 meeting of Troy City Council.
Minutes of Council, April 4, 2022. A public hearing was held on Ordinance Number 012, 2022. Committee reports. Law and Ordinance Committee noted receipt of a liquor license having to do with the Trex for Fermentum Enterprises, LLC. Resolution number R27, 2022. Agreement related to the employees covered by AFSCME was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R28, 2022. Agreement for the employees covered by AFSCME in the Park Department was given first reading and was adopted. Ordinance number 012, 2022, a rezoning, was given second reading. Ordinance number 013, 2022, fixing salaries and wages of certain employees, was given first reading and was adopted. Following various comments, council adjourned at 7:15 p.m.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council wish to dispose of the minutes?
Move to accept the minutes.
Second.
It's been moved to approve the minutes by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We have a plethora of committee reports this evening. We'll begin with the Buildings and Utility Committee and Mrs. Marshall.
All right, on April 11th, this committee met to consider additional funding for the design and rebidding of the North Market Street Stormwater Lift Station Rehabilitation Project. Based on multiple factors, the current project authorization is not sufficient to award a contract. Additional funding sources have been identified and outlined in the detailed report. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to authorize the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an amendment to the professional services agreement with Strand Associates to increase the design costs by $10,000 for a total cost not to exceed $91,000, as well as to authorize the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract in the amount not to exceed $1 million. Also to allocate up to an additional $150,000 from the Community Development Grants from the City of Troy Economic Development Revolving Loan Fund for this project. So that the city is in a position to bid the project as soon as possible, this committee supports emergency legislation. Respectfully submitted, Mr. Twist, Mr. Whidden, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Marshall. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll move on to the Community and Economic Development Committee for 2 reports, and Mr. Schilling.
Okay, thank you. This committee met on April 11th. Mr. Pierce and myself as chairman met to review the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission that an area known as the Strayer annexation in lots 11463 and Inlot 11464 be rezoned from County A1 and A2 to the city zoning of R4, single-family resident district. This committee supports the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission regarding this proposed rezoning and recommends that council adopt ordinance number 012-2022, and that was respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce and Mrs. Snee, myself, Jeff Schilling as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, please move on.
Okay, thank you. This committee members, Mr. Pierce and myself, met on April 11th to review the recommendation of the Tax Incentive Review Council, TIRC, regarding the compliance status of the Troy Town Park, TIF, and 5 enterprise zone agreements that were in place as of December 31st, 2021. Such review and report is required on an annual basis. The TIRC has recommended that the TIF agreement and the remaining 5 enterprise zone agreements be continued. Additional information is detailed in the report. This committee recommends that legislation be prepared accepting the recommendation of the TIRC, that the 5 current enterprise zone agreements be continued, that the Troy Town Park TIF be continued, in that the city must file an annual report for the Ohio Development Services Agency by the end of April regarding the continuance of the agreements, and that the TIF committee supports emergency legislation. And again, this will be respectfully submitted by myself as chair, Mr. Pierce, and Mrs. Snee.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll move on to the Community Partnerships Committee and Mr. Rozell for 2 reports.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On April 11th, this committee met to consider recommending the transfer of property known as Fire Station 11 to the Community Improvement Corporation
of the City of Troy, Ohio, CIC, so that the CIC can proceed to utilize the services of a licensed realtor to market the property on behalf of the city. The CIC board has agreed to this process based on the conditions discussed in the detailed report. It is a recommendation of this committee that the legislation be prepared, transferring in lots 938, 939, the property known as Fire Station 11 to the Community Improvement Corporation, City of Troy, Ohio, so that the CIC can proceed to utilize the services of a licensed realtor to market the property on behalf of the city. The committee supports emergency legislation due to the timing of current Fire Station 11 becoming vacant. This is respectfully submitted by Jeffrey A. Schilling, Todd D. Sievert, and myself, William G. Roselle, as chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rozell. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, Mr. Rozell, you can continue.
Thank you. The committee also met April 11th regarding the 2002 Troy Strawberry Festival to be held June 3rd to June 5th, 2022. The festival is to take place in both the downtown and levee areas and include a beer garden on the lower levee on June 4th and June 5th. The event will continue to provide an opportunity for local nonprofits to raise funds for community purposes while providing an opportunity for residents and visitors to come downtown to enjoy a variety of bands, support local businesses, and support the local nonprofit organizations. The information in the detailed report was discussed. However, the suspension of the door on June 4th will not be recommended. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an agreement with the Troy Strawberry Festival, Inc. for the 2022 Strawberry Festival, provide for a standard notwithstanding legislation, and authorize the sale of beer within an enclosed area on the lower levee on June 4th and June 5th. However, the door will not be suspended on June 4th as requested. The committee supports the legislation being presented as an emergency measure, as the Troy Strawberry Festival, Inc. must submit an application for an F2 permit to the Ohio Division of Liquor Control without delay. This is respectfully submitted. Jeffrey A. Schilling, Todd D. Sievert, myself, William G. Roselle, as chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rozell. Council members have any comments or questions on this item?
I just have a clarification
Mr.
from
Seaver.
Patrick or Grant. This was just notwithstanding legislation anyways, right? So there was not a door suspension that was legislatively created by this committee report.
No, that's correct. That's separate and distinct with regard to that. I mean, if the committee would have recommended that, perhaps legislation would have reflected the suspension within that, but since it didn't, the ordinance does not contain that.
So this is just a notwithstanding.
Right,
Yes.
right, and allowing the beer garden on the levee.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll move on to the Law and Ordinance Committee, and Mrs. Snee with one report this evening.
Thank you, Mr. President. On April 11th, committee members Phillips and Sievert met to review proposed amendments to Choi's ordinance regarding mobile food vendors. Proposed amendments would streamline the process, possibly attract additional mobile food vendors, and retain protections requested by the police department. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared amending Chapter 721 of the codified ordinances to reflect the amendments discussed in the detailed report. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Mr. Wynn?
During the debate on this topic of the committee, there was some discussion about the language requiring all vendors to have background checks on all their employees. I had discussed this matter with the chief of police after that committee. I guess I still feel myself a little bit conflicted on that part of the recommendation. I do very much see the side that the chief was bringing forth when he was talking about that, but I guess I would like to see just what the other members of the council particularly felt about that, because it does seem to be a bit of a little bit beyond normal procedures, I would think, but I just wanted to see if anyone else on council had an opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Wynn. Any council members wish to address Mr. Wynn's concerns? Mr. Phillips?
Coming from my 30 years in law enforcement, as Chief McKinney stated, whenever you have itinerant folks that come through your community, you don't know who they are. They're not applying. They are applying for a mobile vending license. However, you do have unknown folks, and I realize in brick and mortar you're going to have some of the same. However, the equivalent to this is the door-to-door salesman, and as the chief indicated, they have been able to weed out, if you will, some folks that have had warrants and pedophile convictions and other things, that these folks can go into neighborhoods and stuff where they shouldn't be. And this is just another avenue to protect the citizenry within our city for folks that are not from within the city and that sort of thing. So on that standpoint alone, to me, it's a very valuable tool.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Any other comments or questions from council members? Seeing none, we'll open it up for citizens' comments for any item on the agenda. We have 6 resolutions. Oh, I'm sorry. We have an oral report from Mr. Pierce and the Personnel Committee. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, Mr. Pierce, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. The Development Director has recommended the reappointment of Mark Douglas and Larry Smith, both term members to the Community Reinvestment Area Housing Council. I move that Mark A. Douglas and Larry Smith be reappointed to CRA Housing Council for terms commencing immediately and running through 12/31/2024.
I second.
The motion for the reappointment has been made.
Second.
The second by Mr. Pierce, seconded by Mr. Twist. Any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whitten?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Motion is approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Again, I apologize, Mr. Pierce. We now open up to citizens' comments for items on the agenda. We have 6 resolutions and 6 ordinances. If you wish to address council on any of those items, you're more than welcome to come to the podium, give your name and address. You have 2 minutes to address council. Mr. Kerber will be our timekeeper this evening.
Kelly Snyder, 935 Atlantic Street, Troy. So I'm here representing the Miami County Local Food Council. We are the organization that runs the Cherry Street Local Farmers Market. And first of all, thank you for taking the food truck ordinance under consideration. It's something that we have wanted to have revisited for a while. It's very difficult to get food trucks to visit our farmers market because of some of the restrictions that are in place. One of them is the background check for every employee. That is, in my opinion, it's very excessive for those mobile food truck vendors. And you mentioned that they're itinerant, but many of these are our community. They live in our community, and we don't require that of brick and mortar restaurants, which my daughter is in the restaurant industry. You're going to find that in almost every restaurant, folks who maybe are not from, they've had trouble with the law. So I think that that is something I really would like to see revisited, that is it truly necessary, because I think if the vendor who owns that business requires it of their own business, that's understandable, but I don't see how it is beneficial. I understand where the chief is coming from on it, but I also think it's an undue burden on those vendor owners. Also, when you were reviewing this, did you talk to other communities to see if they required this same kind of thing from their food truck vendors? And I guess that's just something I was curious about.
It did come up in our discussion, and it was part of the staff report. I don't recall the number of communities that they polled, if you will, but there were outside folks and an organization of communities, I believe, that they kind of codified or reduced those to a single document, if you will, and condensed them and got pieces and parts from everywhere to put that together.
Okay.
to my recollection. But to your point, if I may answer the question where you say, the local businesses, I get it. But all the vendor has to do is now pay one fee, not multiple, but
Right.
one fee.
Greatly appreciate that.
And just submit a list. Just submit a list with the information that the chief or that the police department requires to do their background check. So it's really not a real burden for the vendor to do that. It makes it a lot easier if they just submit the information and offer it.
It's not costing the vendor anything for the background
Right.
check. They're free.
I think what we've heard from vendors is it's not so much even the cost, it's just the process of having to go downtown, do,
You're gonna have to be there anyway.
To get their
Do the
license.
so-
We had a vendor come to the committee meeting and speak, and he was okay, and he was okay because he was told they could, you don't have to have your 20 employees right now. If you have 5, you do the 5, and if you can add them throughout the year or the season or whatever.
I think where it struck me, Kelly, and this might make a little more sense because it took me a while to grasp my mind around it as well. What you're thinking of is a truck coming to your Cherry Street Market, setting up, selling popcorn, just for an example, right? And under that situation, I could see where the analogy to brick and mortar would be very applicable. But what their concern is the ice cream vendor that's going through streets in Westbrook, or that's where the analogy of the door-to-door salesman became more applicable. Because as a citizen, I think you would want, if someone is selling dilly bars at your little local baseball field, you would want them to have a background check. And you can't really discern the difference between the mobile vendor that has a static location and the one that is truly a mobile vendor on a bicycle selling ice cream. And I think once that concept sort of was explained by the chief at the at that hearing, I think there at that, not hearing, that's the lawyer in me coming out at that committee meeting, I think that's when it really resonated. And I think when you think of it in that concept, do you really want somebody going, through Westbrook, Sherwood, Stonebridge, any of the neighborhoods that hasn't had that background check? I think that's really where it came from.
And I can see that. I guess also, would there be a way to simplify just the information so that we can hand something to a vendor and say, here are the steps you need to do? Do we have something like that, or can we get something like that? Because that's where we run into problems. We really don't know all the steps, and we can read through the ordinance, and it still doesn't always make sense. What is the requirement?
I would think something like that could reasonably be put together in short order.
That would be very helpful, I think, for us, but also for other organizations that are running events that they need to have food trucks at. And then the only other thing I had, if I can ask one thing real quick.
Okay, make it quick.
Okay, so under the ordinance or resolution, I don't know what it is, anyway, there's a list on that says exceptions, and it lists like nonprofits, charities, the city of Troy. So does that mean as a nonprofit, we would be exempt from all those rules anyway?
That's a good question.
Mr. Herbert? Let me
Can you
look into that.
find
I'll
out
let
for me?
you know.
Because
Yeah.
we were told that we had to go through it, but if we don't, I don't want to get around it. But if we have a food truck that we know and we would really like them to be there, if we have that exemption, we'd like to know that. So,
All right.
great.
Thank you, Mrs. Snyder. Any other resident wish to come up and address council on any of the items on the agenda tonight?
Hello, Kathy Roeder. I live at 1164 West Main Street, but I'm here tonight as the staff liaison from the Chamber of Commerce representing the Troy Strawberry Festival. I'm representing the 3 board members that are in attendance tonight. First, want to thank you for the continued partnership that we have with the city of Troy. We really appreciate that. As you know, we have not had a full festival in 2 years, and we've been working with city staff since early in 2022 to make sure that we can provide a safe, family-friendly festival for the attendees as well as the 65-plus nonprofits that do their fundraising at our event each year. We do want to make it make you aware that we are still working through some legal challenges, some liability concerns that we have in relation to the change that the committee made last week, which I do understand. We watched the video and understand that that was fully supported by council members that were in attendance, but did want to make you aware. We appreciate you bringing the clarification tonight about the DORA, but did want to make you aware that we will be coming back with some questions and things, and maybe some additional conversation in regards to the DORA and that how that affects a festival of the size of the Troy Strawberry Festival that brings 150,000 to 175,000 people to the city of Troy. So just wanted to take that opportunity tonight to say thank you again for the partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Roeder. Anyone else in our audience wish to speak tonight? Seeing none, we'll move on to resolutions. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the first resolution of the evening, Resolution R29, 2022?
Resolution number R29, 2022. Resolution accepting the recommendations of the Tax Incentive Review Council and declaring an emergency. This is regarding the enterprise zones. First reading.
Does the council wish to act on the item?
Move for suspension. Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Three reading rule's been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution for the evening, Resolution R30, 2022?
Resolution number R30, 2022, resolution accepting the recommendation of the Tax Incentive Review Council for the Troy Town Park TIF and declaring an emergency. The recommendation is that the TIF be continued. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution, Resolution R31, 2022?
Resolution number R31, 2022. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an amendment to the agreement for professional services with Strand Associates of Cincinnati, Ohio, to provide design services for the North Madison Street Stormwater Lift Station Rehabilitation Project and declaring an emergency. This increases the design by $10,000 for a total of $91,000. First reading.
Does council wish to act on the item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Does council wish to act?
Move to adopt.
Second.
Three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution, Resolution R32, 2022?
Resolution number R32, 2022. A resolution amending resolution number R38, 2020 regarding the allocation of economic development revolving loan funds to the North Madison Street Stormwater Lift Station Rehabilitation Project and declaring an emergency. This will allocate an additional $150,000 of such funds. First reading.
Move for suspension.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
The three reading rule has been suspended.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution of the evening, Resolution R33, 2022.
Resolution number R33, 2022. Resolution amending resolution number R62, 2021, increasing the authorization amount and authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the North Madison Street Stormwater Lift Station Rehabilitation Project and declaring an emergency. This will increase the bidding authorization to $1 million. First reading.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
The three reading rule has been suspended.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Twist. Any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. This time, I would like to read this resolution in memoriam to honor Thomas E. Force, a former city council member and former council president. Whereas the members of council for the city of Troy, Ohio, recognize on behalf of all Troy citizens the service to our city by the late Thomas E. Force. And whereas Thomas E. Force was a lifelong resident of the city of Troy, Ohio, a volunteer with several organizations, a dedicated employee, devoted to his family, and served as an Ohio track official for over 30 years. And whereas Thomas E. Force particularly served the city of Troy as an elected official, serving as council member at large from January 1st, 1976 through March 31st, 1980, appointed as president of council from April 1st, 1980, serving through December 31st, 1981, council member at large from January 1st, 1982 through December 31st, 1991, and finally president of council again from January 1st, 1992 through December 31st, 1993. And whereas Thomas E. Force continued his remarkable public service career by serving on the Troy Planning Commission from May 2nd, 1994 through December 31st, 2017, and on the Troy Board of Zoning Appeals from July 11th, 2007 through December 31st, 2017. And whereas Thomas E. Force was removed from our midst by death on April 5th, 2022. Now therefore be it resolved by the Council of the City of Troy, Ohio, that this expression of appreciation for the dedicated service of Thomas E. Force to this city and the citizens of this community be extended with sincere sympathy to Mrs. Lynn Force, and members of the family of Thomas E. Force. And be it further resolved that a notation of this resolution be placed in the official records of the City of Troy, Ohio, and that the Clerk of Council is hereby directed and instructed to forward a duly attested and signed copy of this resolution to the family of Thomas E. Force.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It has been moved to adopt the resolution in memoriam by Mr. Siebert, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
And Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
We are now passing the resolution around to be signed by all members of council.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on to ordinances. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 012, 2022?
Ordinance number 012, 2022, an ordinance changing the zoning of Inlots 11463 and 11464 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from Miami County zoning of A1 domestic agriculture and A2 general agriculture to the city zoning of R4 single-family residence district. This has been approved by the Troy Planning Commission. It applies a city zoning to the Strayer annexation, and this is the third reading.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next ordinance of the evening? Ordinance 014, 2022.
Ordinance number 014, 2022. Ordinance repealing Chapter 721 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Troy, Ohio, and enacting new Chapter 721 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Troy, Ohio, regarding mobile food vehicles. This is the first reading.
Does council wish to act?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Move to adopt. Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Siebert. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next ordinance of the evening? Ordinance 015, 2022.
Ordinance number 015, 2022. Ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement with the Community Improvement Corporation of Troy, Ohio, regarding the sale of Inlot 938 and Inlot 939 on behalf of the City of Troy and declaring an emergency. This transfers the property known as Fire Station 11, the current Fire Station 11, to the CIC to be sold on behalf of the city. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next ordinance of the evening? Ordinance 016, 2022.
Ordinance number 016, 2022, an ordinance changing the zoning of in-lots 11465 and 11466 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from Miami County zoning of A2, general agriculture, to the city zoning of AR, agricultural residential zoning district. This has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. It is to apply a city zoning to the Ferryman Kerber Annex property. First reading, and this will have a public hearing at the next council meeting.
In consideration of the public hearing that will take place on May 2nd, this will be held over for a second reading. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next ordinance of the evening? Ordinance 017, 2022.
Ordinance number 016, 2022, an ordinance changing the zoning of in-lot 11400 in the, I'm sorry, I think we just read 17. I'm sorry, what did I, okay. Sorry. All right.
Did we
Okay.
inadvertently read
Ordinance number
17?
017, 2022. An ordinance changing the zoning of in-lot 11400 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from Miami County zoning of A2, general agriculture, to the city zoning of AR, agricultural residential district, and changing the zoning of in-lot 11401 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from Miami County zoning of R1AAA, one family residential, to the city zoning of R2, single family residence district. This has also been recommended by the Troy Planning Commission, and it is to apply a city zoning to annex parcel. There will be a public hearing at the next council meeting.
In consideration of a public hearing to be held on May 2nd, this will stand as the first reading of this ordinance. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last ordinance of the evening? Ordinance 018, 2022.
Ordinance number 018, 2022, ordinance authorizing the use of public areas for the 2022 Troy Strawberry Festival, notwithstanding conflicting provisions of the Troy codified ordinances, further approving the use of an area for the sale of beer subject to the issuance of proper permits by the state of Ohio and procurement of liquor liability insurance, and authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement with the Troy Strawberry Festival, Inc., therefore, and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading of the ordinance.
Move for suspension.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three-reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
The three-reading rule has been suspended.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Phillips. Are there any final comments or questions on this item? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
No.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our Community Development Manager, Nikki Reese, to give us a presentation on fair housing regulations.
Right. Good evening. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about fair housing this evening. The month of April, if you did not know, is National Fair Housing Month. It is in honor of the Federal Fair Housing Act that was passed by Congress on April 11th, 1968. That was 7 days after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Tonight, I'm going to give you a very brief, and I say very brief, overview of the Fair Housing Act and kind of review with you the obligations that the City of Troy has because we receive Community Development Block Grant funding. Starting with the brief overview, the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, advertising, design, insuring, and financing of dwellings and other housing-related transactions. Basically, the Fair Housing Act covers all housing issues. It's enforced by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. And HUD is also the federal department that oversees the CDBG funding. There are 7 protected classes under the Federal Fair Housing Act. There's race, color, familial status, which I'm going to kind of give you a definition on that one. Familial status refers to children under the age of 18 living with parents or legal custodians, pregnant women, and people securing custody of children under the age of 18. Religion, sex, which now includes sexual orientation or gender identity. That was adopted just recently in February of 2021. National origin, and then lastly, disability. And then the state of Ohio has 2 more protected classes, and that's military status and ancestry. And these fair housing violations, they include refusing to sell or rent, discriminate in the terms, conditions, whether it is a lease or a mortgage or insurance coverage or an appraisal, again, anything related to housing, any materials that you may print or publish, any statement in connection with the sale or rental of a dwelling which indicates a preference, limitation, or discrimination based on a protected class, misrepresent the availability of housing, engage in blockbusting or steering, refuse people with disabilities, discriminate in making loans, insurance policy, appraisals, and other real estate transactions, and lastly, to coerce, intimidate, threaten, or interfere with any person in the exercise or enjoyment of a fair housing right. Now, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but we do. The city of Choi has an ordinance. We have a fair housing ordinance. It was adopted in April 21st of 1988. It's chapter 515 of our codified ordinances. And I'm just going to read briefly the designation of this policy. It is as follows. It states, "It is hereby designated to be the continuing policy of the city of Troy to do all things necessary and proper to secure for all its citizens their right to equal housing opportunities, regardless of the race, color, creed, sex, marital status, religious belief, national origin, or handicap." It also goes on to talk about unlawful housing practices, and it's specifically to all housing located within the city limits of Troy. It goes on further to talk about the purpose of the Miami County Fair Housing Committee and its primary purpose to investigate all complaints involving unlawful discrimination practices in Troy that are filed through the Fair Housing Officer. And lastly, there's also a penalty. There is a fine if it is violated. Switching gears and going to what are our obligations as a city in regards to receiving community development block grant funding, there's 4 components that we must follow when we receive this funding. The first one is provide fair housing education at a minimum to 3 local organizations. So tonight, I'm counting that as one of my services. Also provide fair housing information. We've got Fair Housing is Your Right, Miami Valley Fair Housing, that's a great organization if you know of anyone that does need legal assistance. There's also, we have a booklet on landlord rights, tenant rights and responsibilities. It goes through the eviction process, both on the landlord and the renter side. We have to provide every 5 years an update on the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. And then lastly, we must have a fair housing local contact. In the city of Troy and the city of Piqua, we decided, I don't know how long ago it was, to make Miami County commissioners as our point of contact for any fair housing calls. It was easier to track all the calls, and then there's consistency with the types of questions and stuff are asked. So Jill Meyer is our fair housing coordinator for Miami County. She performs the complaint intake, provides the general community with the various state law information, materials, etc. She's the intake person. She cannot provide legal advice of any sort, so she'll take the complaint, she'll follow up with who the complainant is against to get both sides of the story, and then make a determination if it should go to the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. They'll take it from there. So just to give you kind of some numbers between 2019 to the present, she's received a total of 135 calls. 35% of those were in the city of Troy, and 100% of those were landlord-tenant issues. So that's kind of where we are with those calls. But I've got the information can be found on the city's website. It's under development, under community development, and then there's a fair housing tab that gives you information on that. Or you can go to the Miami County Commissioner's website, and at the top of their webpage, it says services, drop-down box, fair housing, and that they also have these brochures and information on there. So, does anyone have any questions?
Just to be clear, of all the complaints in Troy, none of them, you're saying none of them got passed up to the Ohio Council rights?
Not that I'm aware of. So you don't have to have an attorney to file a complaint. So there could have been calls that were, went directly to the Ohio Civil Rights Commission that we were unaware of. These are just, the numbers that I just provided you were calls that came into the Miami County Department of Development to our Fair Housing Coordinator.
Any other questions? Mr. Phillips?
As a follow-up to that, we don't get the end result stats anywhere or track that in any fashion?
Not that I'm aware of now. But I can get that information if that would be something that you would be interested in.
How do we identify a potential problem landowner or property owner? You know, how do we deal with them in the future or track any violations and things to make sure that they're behaving?
And I'm not sure as far as if it's public record when it goes to the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, or if it even goes all the way up to HUD. So I don't know what the legalities is as far as can they divulge that information? Can they give names of those individuals that have the complaints against them?
Any other comments or questions?
Thank you.
I failed to do this last time, but I will remember to do it now. Mrs. Knight, do we have any communications or announcements?
No, sir.
Thank you. Moving on to comments of officials, Mayor Odom.
I do not have anything further tonight.
Thank you, Mayor. Director of Public Service and Safety, Mr. Titterton.
Nothing this evening, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Titterton. Mr. Kirby, we got to make it 3 in a row.
I will. Thank you. I have nothing this evening.
Good to see you, Mr. Kirby. Mr. Friggy.
I'll make it unanimous.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Friggy. Do any council members have any comments or questions this evening? Seeing none, we open up to audience comments. If you wish to address council on any topic, now is your time to do it. Please come to the podium, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume. Seeing none, this meeting's adjourned. We'll see everybody back here May 2nd, 2022 for the next meeting of Troy City Council. Thank you.